Good morning. Welcome to another episode in our conversations with persons who have been achievers, who have several accomplishments to their name, and who wear the laurels very lightly, almost invisibly. These are not the people that talk about their achievements. These are the people whose achievements talk for themselves. They are not those that project themselves on the stage. They are the ones that have to be persuaded to claim their legitimate role because of what they have done, what they have achieved, what they have accomplished. In the very large number of companies in India, big, small, old, young, whatever way you categorize it or segment, there are some companies that not just capture the imagination, but stay around for a long time in positions of leadership and continue to demonstrate that hard work, intelligent work, smart work will ensure that the leadership position is retained. One such company, which is an infrastructure giant and which deservedly has the tagline, "We make the things that make India proud." I think it's a very strong statement, but it's a statement that is based on a track record of making things that make India proud. But companies don't exist by themselves. There are persons that ensure that companies are what they are, that companies do what they do. And my guest in this conversation is the co-pilot of that company, which makes the things that make India proud. And clearly, the co-pilot has had a very large role. And I have seen this up close to say with complete confidence that he's the person that holds this vast empire together, ensures that they have what it takes to perform and to be in positions of leadership, as well as to do it in a manner that is sustainable and that is exemplary. Allow me to welcome to the conversation Mr. R. Shankar Raman, the long-standing Chief Financial Officer of the L&T. Welcome, Arasa.
Thank you, sir.
I did have the privilege of seeing you very, very close over the last few years and of interacting with you in boardrooms, in committee rooms, outside of those. So I don't want to start there. I want to start with when you were a young lad yourself and you went to the Padma Seshadri school, if I know right. The Padma Seshadri school, I am aware because I am not a Chennai person, I am a Madras person. If you get what I mean, I go back to that vintage. It's the only school that I know which has been started by a ladies' club and rose to the #1 position. And you had parents whispering in the ears of newborn children, "You must grow up to be smart to qualify to get into Padma Seshadri school." They used to say it earlier of Harvard, but I think now they say that of Padma Seshadri. What was that experience like? Was it fiercely competitive academically and otherwise?
Sir, good morning, and thank you for your very, very kind words of introduction. I think I feel very humbled, especially since it comes from you, because all of us in the industry hold you in such high esteem that we know that some words of appreciation from you means a lot for us. So thank you so much for that. Sir, I somehow have been fortunate that I've always worked in and or part of institutions which are larger than life. I think Padma Seshadri was one such, and a lot of credit to my temperament, my character, my work ethic goes back to Mrs. Y.G. Parthasarathy, who actually started that school. A group of ladies, housewives, who had time to spare, but were deeply committed to development of education, started this school in a small thatched hut. And I think the school, I joined the school in 1969, and the school was started in 62 or 63. So about fourth or fifth batch, so to speak. So infrastructure was very frugal. It's quite a coincidence that I'm spending a lot of my time with a company which makes top class infrastructure. But those days, it was a small building. And as we were going through our schooling, the school started developing in front of our own eyes. I remember that we speak about advocacy. I must mention that Mrs. Y.G. Parthasarathy invited Mr. M. Karunanidhi, who was the chief minister then during that period, to come and inaugurate a certain function of our school. And in the process, made a few of us children make an appeal to him to give us a playground. And by very, very smart propositioning, she got a prime land opposite to the school, which is behind today's Vallur Kotam, as playground for the school. And I think that was the commitment of the lady. And we had exceptional teachers. I think these were teachers who were not teaching because it was remunerative for them. These were teachers who actually wanted to impart education. A lot of weightage was given to character building, culture, and also traditions. We were one of those schools which had daily prayers, which was almost 45 minutes long. And the prayer was broken into prayers. And I mean, we were praying for all faith. It was not any specific god or goddess. And secondly, the prayer also had a 15-minute session by students by rotation on thought for the day. So many of the thoughts that we actually experience in life had its origin in those thought for the day sessions. And we used to work close to 300 days in a year. So there are 300 different students who used to go up and talk for 10 minutes. It also built our extempore capabilities, because we were just told the previous evening as to who will stand up and do that thought for the day session. So there's not much preparation time. So we have to actually piece together whatever that we could do. So I think the education was very purposeful. I don't think it was very competitive, because I don't think the school was drilling into our heads that we should get 99.9. I think the school was actually drilling into our heads that we should become responsible citizens and we should become good human beings. So I think those days were very different in terms of competitiveness. I think it was shaping of character more than actually getting to be number one in the state or in the city.
I'm almost tempted to ask you, because this ladies club also had a good volleyball side, I thought. And there are some people who are setters and some people who are spikers. So the more calm people are the setters, the more, I won't say violent, but aggressive people are the spikers. Clearly, you must have seen some evidence of that growing up. But your chosen game in school was cricket. Is that true?
Yes, sir. I think I, like many of the children in India, I guess, got attracted to cricket. And I grew up watching Mansoor Ali Khan Patowdi play, Jai Simha play. And these are names actually, those days we didn't have, as you know, the television coverage that we have today. So Hindu used to bring a magazine called Sportsline. And it used to have some excellent photographs of Patrick Eager. And the attraction of the photographs was such that it sort of compensated us being in the ground watching these people play. The only occasion we used to see these people play was Ranji Trophy matches. And I remember we used to buy tickets for 5 rupees and 7 rupees. And that used to be a big bargaining program at home to get that 7 rupees capital allocation from the parents' purse and go and watch. So I got drawn to cricket, and I was reasonably good at it. So the school selected me to play for the school. I went on, continued playing. I went on to play for the college, the universities, the Tamil Nadu State Sub-Juniors. As a team, I got selected there. But around the time I finished my graduation, I think I had a choice to make of either staying connected with the game and pursuing the game, or switch track and get serious with academics. I think my father helped me take that decision, and I chose academics because I thought if I'm going to live as long as I'm doing now, The game may not be besides me to help me make my ends meet and get dinner on the table. So academics was a better choice, and I'm thankful that that choice was made. And I'm so consequently, I think my engagement was cricket was until I was in college. Thereafter, I think it slowly waned. Today, I play an odd match when companies play against banks, etc., in a friendly 10 over, 20 over kind of a game. But that's more for fun and not with any seriousness.
Interesting, you say you had to bargain for those 5 or 7 rupees of outlays, and now you are in a situation where business leaders come to you for money, and you have to tell them how capital is important, needs to be conserved, and you got to put your money to better use the rupee to travel a longer distance than it ordinarily does. That's, and I don't want to fast forward you there just yet. You had a brief spell in Western Crompton for a few years, and then you moved to L&T. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I started my CA qualification, and by then I had also become a cost accountant. I joined Western Crompton. It's a very curiously very similar structure to L&T. It's completely professionally managed, owned by institutions and public at large, and it just had professional managers, no owner. And I was associated for about 5-6 years in that company. Started with audit and moved into corporate finance. And they started a financial services outfit in I think mid-80s. And as part of the CFO's team of finance managers, I was assigned to work on that project. So financial services set up, I was associated and worked there for a couple of years. And that's when I got actually introduced to Bombay as financial market. I always knew Bombay as a good holiday destination because my uncles and aunts used to live here, and I used to come and spend some summer holidays time here. But didn't really look at the city as a serious place to live and work. But once I started working in the financial services area of Western Crompton, I had to keep coming to Bombay every month to get banking lines and bills discounted and stuff like that. And I soon realized that if I want to make a career in the financial side of the finance function, then it's important that I drop anchor in Bombay. And that was another big round of bargaining at home because my parents were keen that I should be around them as long as possible. So they were questioning me as to why Chennai then could not provide the career opportunities and that Bombay can. So it was a bit of a negotiation, but unlike the Ranji Trophy days of school days, etc., I was able to be a little more forceful about having my way. Fortunately, they supported me and I moved to Bombay, and I'm very thankful I did that because I think a lot of what I've learned on work today and the culture of work in Bombay is very unique. And sir, you have had the opportunity to work in Bombay in very, very senior positions. So you would appreciate that Bombay believes in getting things done, and the desire to work to a purpose, work to a goal, to be time bound, the discipline of being time bound, all that Bombay has taught. So I think Bombay journey has been very fruitful, and I'm continuing till today. In fact, the years that I spent in Bombay is almost overtaking the years that I've spent outside of Bombay.
And one of your major challenges in Bombay was setting up L&T. So what was it like setting up an institute as compared to working very hard in an institute?
Sir, I think in a moment of bravado, I appeared for that interview with L&T. I think many times we sort of criticize the consultants for suggesting things that don't go well. But I think to the credit of McKinsey then in the early 90s, they suggested that L&T should get into services business. At that time, L&T was known for manufacturing and projects. They were just about making their mark, but they were more for manufacturing that they were known. And they found that McKinsey found in their study that the next 20 years, the GDP composition is going to have more weightage for services. And if L&T wants to make its position strong, it has to get its presence in that field established. So information technology services business and financial services business was identified as two areas where L&T can possibly play a meaningful role. And L&T chose to pursue both. And as they say, rest is history, because we have fairly successful portfolio of IT services business today. 3 of them, including the one that we have acquired, and we have a listed financial services company. So when I was working in Western Crompton and I had this stint in setting up financial services business, and I approached it a little lightheartedly, saying it's a good experiment to see what it takes to set up a financial services firm, but never really realized that's going to be my passport or visa to come into L&T. L&T, after some 7 or 8 rounds of interview, and I never realized that one needs to go through such diligence, such detailed diligence, and L&T's HR processes were pretty thorough. And I think over time, my belief is that some of those have got diluted because of the scale and the speed with which recruitment needs to happen. And the whole talent management dynamics have changed today. But those days, I think we were more keen to be employed by L&T or such organizations. So we had to endure those 6, 7, 8 rounds of interviews. And finally, they selected me to work on the blueprint for financial services plan. And I remember the nights that I used to work sitting on my sofa in my living room, trying to put a 5-year plan. And we weren't as lucky technology-wise those days, and I'm talking about 92, 93, that we didn't have laptops and we didn't have familiarity with Excel spreadsheets as much as we do today. So consequently, everything was done on a Casio calculator. And we used to come and present it back to the executive committee of L&T. And after about 3 months of hard work, I got a princely sum of 5 crores allocated by L&T for setting up the financial services. And that is how my journey with L&T began. And that 5 crores had to be very carefully utilized, because the belief was 1:10 gearing was possible for financial services firm. So I was supposed to raise 50 crores on the back of that 5 crore and create an asset base of about 55 crores. But fortunately for me, I think Mr. Devasthale, who was my sponsor, unfortunately, he's no more with us today, but he was my mentor and sponsor through the period of his tenure and my tenure, overlapping tenure there. He has been a great supporter. He helped me set that business up, recruit people. It was a startup experience, sir, and an experience that I would like to carry in my memories through my professional life, because it taught me a lot of things. It taught me the importance of policies. It taught me the importance of processes. It also taught me the importance of putting the purpose before people. And it was so important that we need to have the ability to influence outcomes. So the responsibility, and at that time I was in the mid-30s, and not that I've had great years of experience. So I was learning on the go, and I had very supportive environment to do that. And it was important that we sell the idea of financial services business, because to borrow and lend, L&T was a little allergic, because they were always worried, what if the borrowers from L&T does not return the money, whereas our obligation to pay to our lenders stays. So this asset liability mismatch, I mean, today we are far more familiar with these concepts thanks to RBI's various policy prescriptions. But those days, it was not so well formed. So all this asset liability management and the ability to be choosing prudently whom to lend and do a project evaluation, payback period for the assets that we were financing, those were fundamentals of financial services business, and that we learned. And secondly, to go and sit with the customer, identify his need ahead of his requirement was also something that experience taught me. Because I think once the need is identified, I would be way behind in the queue of lenders wanting to lend to that particular entity, particularly if they're a very creditworthy entity. So how to get ahead of the queue is to have thought thought partnerships. So what I learned through this process was, I think it is very important to co-create an idea with your ultimate customer. And once you do that, then you get the foot in the door, and all the other things remaining same. Competitiveness cannot be compromised. But it's very, very important to actually think ahead of time with your customer. So that's something that I've learned. And I'm very glad today that 5-6 years that I stayed with L&T Finance, setting up the initial team. And by the time I was transferred to the parent L&T, the team was almost 180, 190 strong. To interview each one of them. At that time, we didn't have so much of delegated authority for recruitment. So I had to personally get involved in interviewing. So tremendous amount of hard, exciting work, but we could see an institution take shape. And since you have been part of institution building, you will be able to empathize with the satisfaction that you get if some of those things actually play out well. I am today quite glad that the institution has become now 20,000 strong. It is another matter that we still are tasked with value creation in that business. But that apart, I think it's very, very satisfying to know that the initial seeds that we were able to sow there has sort of blossomed into a large tree today. And hopefully, I think it will continue to serve L&T's interest for a long time, much beyond my time.
I have two questions. They're not necessarily related, but I want you to look at them if possible in related fashion. Barring the couple of years in Western Crompton, or 3-4 years, you've been what is called an L&T lifer. People use the word lifer in several ways, but you spent all your working life until today in L&T. These days, youngsters, after they complete a year, maybe 2 years, are updating the series. What do you think has caused that change? No long-term commitment to an organization. Just a question of where do I get a little more money, or are they looking for a little more satisfaction? They're looking for bigger challenges, because you stayed, several of your contemporaries joined the company and stayed for many years, decades. And my other question is, and I mean this with great respect to the person that I have in mind, you grew up professionally under a banyan tree. What was it like growing up under a banyan tree and yet being able to establish yourself as an individual, as a business leader of you?
Very interesting question, sir. Especially the first question. We constantly deal with that issue on a daily basis because talent retention has become very, very important. And we are only as good as our teams. And it is very important to surround ourselves with people who have better capability than ourselves to make sure that we are able to deliver to the stated cause. I think in comparison to the days when I decided to drop anchor in L&T, I think the opportunity spectrums have widened considerably to people today. Those days, I think the hierarchy was very clear. If you are smart, you will go to civil services. If you are a little less smart, you will work possibly in a bank or an insurance company through the probationary officer's route. And the rest used to go to private sector. And within private sector, we had the categorization of Hindustan Levers of those days and the Cadburys, and then possibly the rest in some order. But today, I think if much of the youngsters have a much shorter shelf life, it is a function of the opportunities that beckons them today. It's also possibly a generational thing that we were willing to play a 5-day test. We believed that if you are in the right platform, possibly the returns would come in due course. And we were always taught to believe that give importance to the role and the function. And the rest of the additives will find its way, be it a designation, a car, or a position, or a cabin with a secretary. All that we were told will follow. So we were of that mindset that we have to first invest to reap the benefits. Today is a bit of an instant gratification, especially you would have seen with interest the kind of valuations that loss-making, cash-guzzling startups today enjoy. And I think I'm connecting that to the question about people, because why would somebody pay 50 times the earnings, 60 times the earnings, 100 times the earnings to a startup to take a share, a part of the equity of that company? So I think today the benefits seem to outrun the results. And I think there's a lot of leap of faith that is happening, and that's the same thing that is getting carried to individuals when they make their decision to switch. Because of that opportunity pie having been enlarged, and today it's not only Indian opportunity, it is global opportunity. And to that extent, I think the IT world has put Indian talent on the global map. And I think all of us are very thankful for that industry to have evolved the way it has and given a lot of respectability to Indian professionals and the capabilities of people. So my thinking is, I think people today stay far lesser in organizations because they have alternate options, which is paying obviously better. So there's no need. And some of the candidates have argued with me that the money that you make or the career that you grow in one place over 25 years. Another model, very viable model, is spend in 5 places at 5 years apiece and keep aggregating. But it's I guess, a question of philosophy. I somehow believe that it always pays to create value by staying stable. But it's a classic case of T20 cricket versus test match cricket, sir. So I guess both will coexist, and we will continue to find people, and we still do in our company. I have people who work for long years. I have people whom I have recruited who are completing 15 years, 17 years, etc. Except that we might have to have the engine more robust, because we have to recruit 100 people to retain 40 people. Earlier, it was enough to recruit 50 people or 60 people to retain 40 people. So I think to that extent, the processes have got readjusted. On the other part of growing in an organizations under the tutelage of stalwarts, I think the adage is nothing grows under the banyan tree. But I think I have seen around people in L&T actually disprove that adage, and I think many careers have blossomed under stalwarts of leaders in L&T. And I'm also aware that there are a lot of people who worked with you, under your mentorship, have so many good things to say about you, and they've grown under you. So I guess it is possible that under very well-meant, purposeful leadership, people can find their own ground. I think the importance here is the ability of leadership to entrust responsibility and accountability. I think today, generally, people measure growth as what is the designation that I carry. I think we need to flip it around. And I keep saying this to my people, that we don't promote you to the next grade because you are 3 years old in an earlier grade. We promote you to the next grade because you can share larger responsibility. Your skin in the game increases to that extent. Your commitment increases. So I think what the environment in L&T, and since I have worked for most part of my career in L&T, I can only relate and speak about L&T. In L&T, what I found is once there is a trust that gets built about your accountability to deliver, the responsibility comes on you like a deluge. And I think the environment is so trusting, so enabling. And if you're able to keep pace with that expectation and bend your back and deliver, and I think all of us join as professionals with no godfather in the system. There is nobody in the L&T system who actually speaks for the other. It is our work which speaks for itself. So it's very important to invest quality orientation to the work that we do. And no work is small or big. I think all work have a place in that value chain. It's very important to understand our work in the context of what value it creates rather than just a task to be done. Once that orientation develops in us, I think we begin to see the larger picture and then move towards it. So I have benefited from the wisdom and the mistakes that I've got committed, the process slips that have happened. And I also should, many times I wonder the evolved regulations, whether they are a punishing schedule or there are an enabling schedule. I think the way regulations have evolved have also enabled us to conduct ourselves with greater responsibility. However demanding, exacting it is to comply with all these growing regulations, I think it has been very important to define the channel, and they act as guardrails. And I think L&T, both the leadership, the trust that we have all enjoyed, and the regulations and the orientation to be compliant. I think we normally tell ourselves that we don't want to be only the company that makes things that make India proud. We also want to be a company which is benchmarked for its governance, for its processes and practices. I think it should be an university for professionals to possibly spend time and learn. Some will pass through, some will stay back, but we hope over time our retention will justify the path we have chosen.
I have 3 or 4 questions, one of which you answered already when you spoke about regulations, which was whether the world is getting increasingly prescriptive. So I won't allow that to detain us. But tell me, for an infrastructure company with so many businesses, JVs, subsidiaries, you name it, every kind of combination is present in the space that you look after. Quarterly rendering of accounts, is that a good thing or is that a terrible thing?
Sir, I think it is, I mean, whether it's good or terrible, I would like to context it not from the effort required to comply, but from the purpose it serves. In companies which are project oriented, the outcome of the project, as how the company has fared undertaking that project execution responsibility, is known only when you measure the outcome over the project duration. When we actually try to artificially create timeline thresholds of 90 days or 180 days, etc., what happens is we actually bring a curtain down at a point in time, regardless of where the project is, and try to assess whether we have performed well or not. As a company, since we are a sigma of 1,000 such projects, some projects are in advanced stage, some projects are in early stage, etc. What the results show is some golden average, which need not necessarily point out very clearly as to whether the project in the overall context is doing well or not. Now, to my own personal preference, I think yearly would be the most ideal way to measure the outcome, because projects are typically 3 years. So 1/3 of the project is reasonable timeline to assess the outcome as to which way the project is going. 90 days is too short. But I understand these requirements have come out because the investing world has become something which believes in churning the investments. So they don't have the patience to wait for 180 days or 360 days. So definitely not for 365 days. So I guess I would argue, if I'm given space to speak about it, is that we should move over to very industry-based timelines for this. Service industry, it can measure itself to 90 days more easily. Sequential quarter on quarter is also very possible and feasible, relevant in service industry like IT industry or financial services. In a project industry, to make them close in 90 days and thereafter to compare previous quarter with the current quarter is actually more misleading than leading in terms of indication. So I don't think it's a good idea to have one size fits all approach to this financial reporting. We can possibly move towards it if the regulators do not think that they're diluting standards. In a couple of occasions, when I've had an opportunity to sit with the regulator and discuss about this, they were empathetic to the points that was being made, but they were saying that we don't want to be seen as somebody who's actually moving down the standards. So That's where we are. But I would bat for at least once in 6 months and not definitely quarter for our kind of business.
Okay. That's very heartening because I find myself in that small group of people which says that quarterly accounting was the wrong way for India to go. Let me combine 2 or 3 interests of yours, and I know that you have many. I know you run the marathon. I know that you play badminton 3 times a week. I know that you are a big Lata Mangeshkar fan, and you also read P.G. Boddas. I'm trying to see a common thread in this. The marathon definitely has kept you going for a long period in L&T. The badminton that you play helps you take those fine decisions of whether the shuttle is going to fall inside or outside. Perhaps. I think Lata Mangeshkar really brings that spirit that informs the work, why we do what we do. It's not about money, it's not about other things, but some of the lines in her songs. But tell me, what is the one line of Jeeves that you like the best? Coming to PG.
Sir, you asked a very tough question because I'm not able to. When I pick up that book or chapters in that book, I tend to immerse myself more holistically in the humor. The humor. I'm not able to recall offhand just a line as something that has stuck with me, but just that experience of the humor between the master and the butler, that is some experience for which I read, and I go back to reread some of the old books that I have. But when we run short of space, unfortunately, books which gather dust become the casualty. So I'm guilty of some of those library shelves becoming vacant to accommodate clothes and stuff like that. Shameful to admit that, but I'm in one situation like that now.
I think it happens to all of us. Just 2 quick comments. You did refer to the civil service earlier on about how smart boys qualified for civil service. I qualified 50 years ago, 50 years and a few months ago. And at that time, it used to be said it was a cruel comment to make when you look at gender diversity achievements of women. It was said that the bright young men join the civil services, the bright young women join Air India. When you think of Air India now, you tend to worry whether it was fair to them in any context at all. I want to share with you, and I want to close. There's one line of Jeeves that occurred to me to capture the essence of Jeeves. This was when his Lord and Master was courting a woman, and Jeeves was ironing his clothes, the Master's clothes, and he made a comment, well, each one of us is pressing his suit in a different way. And I thought there are ways and ways in which it could have been put, but that was, I thought, very well put. Thank you, RSR. It's been a privilege having you in this conversation. And I think the younger people that get the opportunity to hear you, I think will take away a lot without your sounding prescriptive, without your sounding preachy. You've managed to communicate so many of the things that people should look at, absorb, and which should enable people. Thank you. It's been a privilege chatting with you.
It's my privilege, sir, to participate in a conversation with you. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed it thoroughly, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.